the moment that changed everything. From the outside, Hollywood often appears as a place filled with bright lights, polished smiles, and moments orchestrated so perfectly that they look almost impossible to have been shaped by ordinary human emotions. Yet beneath all of that, behind the curtains, behind the carefully crafted interviews and slow-motion red carpet entrances, there are stories woven with truth, vulnerability, and the type of raw humanity that refuses to be hidden no matter how much fame tries to cover it. Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock had always been described as the rare exception in an industry often defined by ego. For decades, they had shared something that neither of them fully named, a connection that felt familiar, comforting, grounding, like they were meeting each other again every time they crossed paths, even after years apart. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it lived quietly in the spaces between them, in the way he would turn slightly whenever she laughed, in the way she noticed how gently he entered every room, in the understanding that some people simply were meant to walk beside each other's paths even if they never planned to. Their history stretched back to the mid-90s when they filmed Speed, a time filled with youthful excitement, long shooting hours that somehow felt shorter because of how much they enjoyed each other's company, and moments when they would sit together between takes, discussing life not as celebrities, but as two people trying to understand who they were in a world that demanded too much too fast. Back then, neither of them realized that the bond forming between them would last 30 years and continue to evolve into something deeper, something softer, something so emotionally layered that neither of them dared to label it. What they did know, even then, was that their friendship mattered. It was real. It was sacred. And even though life, careers, relationships, tragedy, and time all forced them down separate paths, something in both their hearts kept the connection alive like a quiet flame refusing to die out. Years later, in a world where both had changed, where loss had reshaped Keanu's outlook and motherhood had reshaped Sandra's, they found themselves invited to the same charity event, a small, private gathering meant to raise funds for children's hospitals. The location was simple yet elegant. A warm, softly lit venue in Los Angeles filled with artworks created by young patients, with classical music humming gently in the background and guests speaking in polite tones, as if everyone collectively understood that the night was more about compassion than glamour. Keanu arrived early, dressed in his usual understated style, offering subtle nods and small smiles to anyone who recognized him, while Sandra arrived a little later, wearing a deep navy dress that seemed to reflect her calmness and maturity. When she walked in, Keanu felt a familiar warmth, the same warmth he had felt decades earlier, spreading through him, not because of attraction alone, but because her presence had always been one of grounding, reminding him that there was still softness in the world no matter how much darkness one had survived. Their reunion began the way it always did, with a hug that lasted longer than expected, a hug that didn't feel like two celebrities greeting each other, but like two friends who finally found silence long enough to breathe again. They talked casually at first, about life, about work, about things they laughed at online, about the small details that filled their daily routines. Yet under the surface, something different was happening. Keanu seemed quieter than usual, thoughtful in a way Sandra didn't ignore, and Sandra, who always sensed shifts in people she cared about, felt the heaviness behind his smile. She had always been able to read him, his silence, his pauses, the way he swallowed before speaking, and that night she knew he was carrying something he wasn't sure how to express. As the charity speeches continued, and the room filled with stories of bravery from children fighting unimaginable battles, Sandra felt herself becoming emotional. These moments always reminded her of why she valued kindness above everything else. She glanced at Keanu and saw that he too was deeply moved, his eyes reflecting the soft light as if absorbing every story told on stage. When the final speaker finished, people began moving around again, forming small conversation circles, laughing, sharing drinks, and bidding on art pieces for charity. Keanu, however, seemed distant, not disconnected, but introspective, as if he were gathering the courage to say something that had been weighing on him for far too long. Sandra noticed immediately. She always did. She walked over to him, gently nudging his arm with the familiarity of someone who didn't need permission to care. "You okay?" she asked softly, her voice warm, her eyes searching his face not as a co-star, but as someone who had always held space for him without conditions. Keanu hesitated before answering, almost as if he feared breaking open something he had spent years keeping guarded. He nodded lightly at first, then shook his head, then took a slow breath, and Sandra knew immediately this wasn't small. This wasn't casual. This was something important. "Let's step outside for a second," Keanu murmured, his tone low, almost trembling with unspoken weight. They walked out to the balcony, where a gentle breeze moved through the trees and city lights glittered below like scattered diamonds. The outside world felt quieter, safer, as if the universe was granting them a private moment that had been postponed for years. Sandra leaned her elbows against the railing, looking up at the sky, waiting patiently for him to speak. Keanu stood beside her, but he didn't look at the city or the sky. He looked at her, at the curve of her silhouette, at the softness in her posture, at the familiarity of the presence that had always grounded him through the chaos of fame and tragedy. He swallowed hard, and Sandra felt the shift in the energy between them. "Sandra," he finally said, his voice lower, heavier, carrying a tremor she had rarely heard from him. She turned her head toward him, her eyebrows gently pulling together in concern, ready to listen, ready to hold whatever he needed to release. He hesitated, looking for the right words, not dramatic ones, not romantic cliches, but the kind of words that came from wounds, from memories, from moments he wished he could rewrite. The silence stretched in a way that wasn't uncomfortable but sacred, like the space before a confession that could change the direction of two lives. "That night," Keanu whispered, almost as if afraid of his own voice, "the night we wrapped speed, I think my life began shifting in a way I didn't understand at the time." Sandra listened quietly, her heart already beating faster, not because she expected something romantic, but because she sensed something deeply emotional coming. Keanu continued, his words slow, deliberate, fragile. "We were so young, Sandra, so full of energy, and yet, even then, I felt something for you. Something I didn't acknowledge because I didn't know how." Sandra's breath caught, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that she felt her chest tighten, as if her heart were leaning forward to catch the truth he was finally letting slip after nearly 3 decades. Keanu kept speaking, his voice soft but steady, as if every word was clearing a weight that had been holding him back from emotional freedom. "You've always been someone I admired," he said, his eyes lowering for a second as if ashamed of how long it had taken him to admit it. "Not as an actress, not as a co-star, but as a human being. You're grounded, strong, kind, and every time life pulled us in different directions, there was always this part of me that wondered, what if? What if I had said something? What if I had told you how much you meant to me back then?" Sandra felt her throat tighten, her eyes stinging with the rising pressure of unshed tears. She tried to breathe deeply, but her emotions were gathering faster than she could regulate them. She had never expected this, not from Keanu, not after decades of friendship built on mutual respect and silent understanding. She opened her mouth slightly, wanting to speak, wanting to reassure him, wanting to take away the heaviness he was finally revealing, but no words came out. Only a faint, trembling inhale. Keanu looked at her with a vulnerability so rare, so open, that Sandra felt her heart break and expand at the same time. "I don't want you to misunderstand," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I'm not saying this expecting anything. I'm not trying to change anything. I need you to know that you've mattered to me in ways I never told you. Maybe it's too late, maybe it always was, but I don't want to keep carrying this without you knowing." Sandra's voice finally broke, not from pain, not from guilt, but from the overwhelming emotional truth of the moment. "Keanu," she whispered, her voice trembling so deeply that it was barely audible. She pressed a hand to her chest, trying to steady herself, but the emotional weight was too immense. Her eyes filled completely, the tears threatening to spill, and for the first time in a long time she felt speechless, stripped of every witty line, every steady response, every protective layer she normally carried. It wasn't his confession alone that shook her. It was the sincerity, the honesty, the years of unspoken connection finally rising into words that made everything they had shared suddenly make sense. Her voice cracked again when she tried to speak a second time, her emotions pouring through every syllable even though she hadn't yet found the words to respond. And in that moment, with the city lights shimmering below, with the breeze brushing softly between them, with decades of silent feelings finally spoken aloud, Sandra realized that this conversation was about to change everything. The words she never thought she'd say. For several seconds after Keanu's confession, the air on the balcony felt suspended in a strange, delicate stillness, the kind of quiet that wraps around two people when a truth too large to ignore finally surfaces. Sandra stood there, her fingers lightly trembling where they rested against the railing, her breath uneven and fragile as her mind attempted to process the magnitude of what he had just confessed. It wasn't just the words. It was the history behind them, the decades of unspoken emotions, the small moments that suddenly seemed heavier now that they had context. She felt as though the timeline of their friendship had been laid out before her in slow motion. Every laugh they shared on set, every time she caught him watching her from a distance with a softness he never explained, every interview where their chemistry felt so natural that people assumed it was rehearsed. All of it returning in vivid waves, reminding her that perhaps she too had felt something she never dared to address. Keanu didn't move. He kept his eyes on her, though not in a demanding way. His gaze held no expectation, no pressure. It was simply honest, painfully, beautifully honest, as if he had decided that even if this moment broke him, he would rather be broken by truth than protected by silence. The vulnerability in his eyes was startling, not because he seemed fragile, but because he had always been composed, steady, almost untouchable in the quiet strength he carried. Tonight, however, that strength bent toward her in a way that revealed the human beneath the legend. A man who had loved quietly, respectfully, patiently, without ever crossing a line or risking her comfort. That was what made Sandra's heart ache the most, that even now, after bearing his truth, he still prioritized her ease over his own emotional release. Sandra took a slow breath, her chest rising as if she were trying to gather every unspoken word she had buried over the years. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the actor the world admired, not the celebrity she shared a screen with, but the man she had trusted for decades, the man whose kindness had carried her through difficult times, whose presence had always felt like a quiet home, a safe corner of the world she could return to when everything else felt overwhelming. Her eyes softened and she whispered, "Keanu, I don't even know where to begin," her voice barely steady, sounding as if it were made of trembling glass. He opened his mouth to respond, but she lifted a hand gently, signaling for a moment to speak, and he nodded, respecting the fragile space she was trying to navigate. She looked out over the city, the shimmering skyline blurring slightly through her tears, and spoke in slow, measured breaths that carried more emotion than any performance she had ever given. "You have no idea," she whispered, her words trembling, "how many times I thought about us, too. Not romantically, at least not in the way people imagine it, but in the way where I questioned whether there was something deeper between us that we never allowed ourselves to explore." Her admission hit Keanu silently but intensely. His chest tightened, not with hope but with the overwhelming weight of finally sharing a truth they had both secretly held. Sandra continued, her voice steadier now but still thick with emotion. "Back then, I wasn't ready for anything. I was still figuring out who I was, trying to navigate my career, trying to understand my own feelings. And you were always so respectful, so gentle, so patient. That sometimes I wondered if I relied on you more than I should have." She exhaled deeply, and her breath left her body in a long, shaky release as she remembered long-forgotten moments, late-night conversations on set, the way she felt strangely comforted every time he stood beside her, the way she remembered little things he said even decades later. Keanu listened silently, resisting every impulse to reach for her hand because he feared interrupting the emotional honesty unfolding between them. She looked at him again, her eyes shining, and said, "You were the only person who never asked anything of me, never pushed, never made me feel like I owed you something. That's rare, Keanu, that's so rare. And maybe that's why this is hitting me the way it is." She pressed her lips together, fighting back tears, then continued with a voice heavy with vulnerability. "When you told me just now that you felt something for me back then, it brought back so many moments I didn't know I still carried. Moments where I would wonder later, long after filming ended, whether I had missed something important, whether I had missed you." Her voice cracked on the last word, and Keanu's heart clenched painfully, not from regret, but from the realization that the connection he had felt for years had not been one-sided after all. Sandra shook her head slightly, wiping a tear that escaped despite her attempt to stay composed. "And the truth is, there were times when I wished we had talked about this earlier. Not because I think we should have been together or because I think life would have turned out differently in some magical way, but because I think we spent years pretending not to feel what we felt, even if we didn't know how to name it." She took another breath, this one steadier, as if saying the words was slowly liberating her from the emotional weight she had carried for decades. Keanu finally spoke, his voice soft and low. "I didn't want to ruin anything. You mattered too much. Our friendship mattered too much. I was afraid that saying something would make things complicated or put pressure on you or hurt you." Sandra felt a deep ache in her chest hearing that because it reminded her of all the times she had sensed something beneath the surface but ignored it out of fear of misunderstanding the connection. "You never hurt me," she whispered. Not once. You've only ever made my life better. A long silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with the sounds of the city, the distant hum of traffic, the soft rustling of leaves, and the pounding of two hearts realizing that the emotional truth they had avoided for years had finally emerged into the open. Sandra finally stepped closer, her shoulder brushing his gently, and although it was a small movement, it carried decades of suppressed emotion. She looked into his eyes, and the vulnerability she saw there, the mixture of fear, relief, and tenderness, nearly broke her. I'm not upset, she whispered, as if trying to ease something she sensed in him. I'm not shocked, I'm not uncomfortable, I'm overwhelmed, in the best and hardest way. She laughed softly, a fragile sound filled with affection and disbelief. Leave it to you to tell me something life-changing in the calmest, quietest tone ever. Keanu smiled, the faintest, softest smile, but his eyes remained emotional, almost luminous under the balcony lights. I didn't plan this, he said. I didn't want to bring this up tonight, but being here, seeing you, hearing those stories inside, it all made me realize how short life is, and how I didn't want to keep something like this locked away anymore. Sandra nodded slowly, her eyes lowering for a moment as she absorbed his words. Life had taught her many lessons about timing, about love, about loss, about courage, and one of the greatest lessons was that some truths needed to be spoken before time made them irrelevant. She placed her hand gently on his arm, a small gesture but one filled with decades of unspoken reassurance. Thank you for telling me, she whispered. It means more than you think. Keanu exhaled, his shoulders subtly relaxing as if the confession he had feared for so long had finally loosened its grip. But before he could speak again, Sandra added something that made his breath hitch painfully. And I want you to know something too, she said. If things had been different, if life hadn't pulled us in different directions, if timing had been kinder, I don't know what would have happened between us. But I do know this, you were one of the people I cared about most. And maybe some part of me always wondered, what if too? Her confession hit him with a depth he couldn't describe. It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't a regret. It was something more human, more honest. An acknowledgement that their connection had always been uniquely theirs, rare, unforced, and emotionally profound. Keanu lowered his head slightly, swallowing hard, overwhelmed by the quiet truth in her words. Sandra watched him, her heart unraveling in ways she hadn't expected tonight. And then, almost instinctively, she reached up and brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear, a nervous gesture she hadn't done since she was younger. Keanu noticed it instantly, the way he always noticed the small things about her. And for a brief moment, both of them stood there surrounded by the ghosts of memories they never talked about, realizing that this conversation was dissolving years of unspoken emotions in real time. Their eyes met again, and this time the silence between them wasn't heavy or hesitant. It was filled with possibility, with healing, with an emotional clarity they had avoided for too long. Sandra took a breath, preparing to say something that would shift the moment into even deeper territory. Keanu, she whispered, her voice soft but certain, there's something I've never told you either. And as she prepared to reveal her own long-buried truth, Keanu felt the world around them fade into the background, knowing that whatever she was about to say next might change the meaning of everything they thought they understood about their connection. The truth she carried in silence. The moment Sandra whispered that she had something she had never told him, the air around them shifted into a deeper, almost sacred stillness. As if even the night itself sensed that the truth she was about to reveal carried years of emotional weight, unspoken memories and feelings she had carefully buried beneath layers of maturity, life experience, and the protective instincts she developed after decades in an industry that often demanded emotional restraint. Keanu's heart tightened in his chest, not from fear but from a profound anticipation, because he knew Sandra well enough to understand that she never used words lightly. Whenever she said she had something important to share, it meant she had been carrying it for a long time, perhaps too long, and the way her voice trembled when she admitted it made him realize that her silence had not been indifference. It had been caution, protection, maybe even fear of disrupting the delicate balance of their long-standing bond. He stood still, watching her, giving her the space she needed, trying not to suffocate her with expectations, even though every instinct in him leaned forward, waiting for her heart to speak. Sandra didn't rush. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a moment, and placed both hands on the balcony railing, grounding herself as if preparing to unlock a chapter she had sealed long ago. When she opened her eyes again, they glistened with a mixture of vulnerability and courage. the kind that only emerges when a person decides to finally confront the emotions they've avoided for years. Keanu, she began softly, her voice rich with layers of emotion, you weren't the only one who felt something back then. I just didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know how to understand it without complicating everything. Keanu's eyes widened slightly, not in surprise, but in quiet, heartbreaking recognition. Sandra continued, her gaze drifting into the distance as though the memories were unfolding in front of her. The truth is, you were one of the first people I met in this industry who made me feel seen. Not for my looks, not for the hype, not for the film, but for me. She swallowed, her throat tightening as her emotions rose, and she kept speaking in long, steady breaths. People don't realize how lonely Hollywood can be. You're surrounded by crowds, lights, noise, expectations, judgments, but very few real connections. And when we filmed together, something about your presence felt like a quiet escape from all of that. You listened. You cared. You noticed the things no one else bothered to see. And after filming ended, I kept thinking about how different everything felt when you were around. Her voice trembled again as she added, I didn't call it affection back then. I didn't even allow myself to think of it as feelings. I just knew that whenever we crossed paths, a part of me felt safe. Keanu inhaled deeply, his heart pounding with the realization that the connection he had felt so intensely had been mirrored in her, even if life had pulled them apart before either of them could understand the full depth of what they shared. Sandra's gaze softened as she looked at him, her voice thick with emotion. You know, there were so many interviews after Speed, where people asked us if we liked each other, if something was going on. And every time I'd laugh it off and say, no, of course not, because I was protecting myself from the possibility that I might be reading too much into things. And I was protecting something else too, our friendship. I was terrified of losing that. The honesty in her words struck Keanu like a quiet earthquake, subtle but deep, shifting everything he thought he understood about their past. Sandra wiped a tear that had begun sliding down her cheek, then continued, her tone becoming more introspective. But there's something I've never told you, something I've never told anyone. After Speed, for a short time, I found myself wondering what it would have been like if we had at least talked about it, really talked, without the fear, without the pressure, without the cameras. I kept thinking maybe we owed ourselves that honesty, but I was so young and life was overwhelming. And then everything happened so fast. We got new films, new commitments, new relationships, and somehow, the moment just slipped away. Keanu lowered his eyes for a moment, absorbing the bittersweet truth in her voice, and when he looked back at her, there was a softness in his expression that made her chest tighten. Sandra, he murmured gently, you don't owe me anything, you never did. But Sandra shook her head slowly, her eyes steady and filled with emotion. Maybe not, but I owe myself honesty now, and I owe you the truth you deserve. She stepped closer to him, not touching him, but close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her presence, close enough that if either of them leaned just slightly, they would fall into an embrace neither of them had allowed themselves in their younger years. There were moments, she whispered, her voice fragile but steady, when I thought maybe it could have been more. Maybe if we had been a little braver, a little more open, things might have taken a different path. Maybe we would have given ourselves a chance. The weight of those words hit him so deeply he couldn't speak for a moment. He looked at her with eyes filled with emotion, and Sandra felt her own heart respond instinctively, as if the truth she had guarded for decades had finally found the light it needed to breathe freely. She saw his chest rise and fall, his breath unsteady, and she reached out gently, placing her hand over his, the most natural gesture in the world, but one that carried the emotional gravity of a confession neither of them had ever given voice to. Keanu's fingers tightened around hers, not possessively, not with expectation, but with a depth of feeling that only two people who have carried emotional history for years could understand. The quiet connection that had lived beneath the surface of their friendship for decades suddenly felt visible, tangible, undeniable. And Sandra could feel her heart aching with something that was not regret but recognition. Recognition of the bond they had both tiptoed around for so long. She took another breath, her voice deepening as she dove into an even more vulnerable truth. There was a moment, she said, years after Speed, long after the world had made up its own stories about us, when I saw you again at an event. You walked in and I remember thinking, God, there he is, the one person who always made sense. And I remember wondering why my heart reacted the way it did, why it still reacted after so many years. She laughed softly, though her voice still trembled. And I ran from that feeling. I told myself it was just nostalgia, just memories, just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I think I knew. Keanu listened, his heart swelling with every word, every admission, every piece of her truth that aligned so deeply with the unspoken things he had felt for years. Sandra looked into his eyes, seeing the quiet storm of emotion swirling in them, and she realized that her words were not breaking him. They were freeing him, freeing both of them from the emotional restraint that had shaped their connection for decades. "I don't regret my life," she said softly. "I don't regret the choices I made, or the people I loved, or the family I built. But I do sometimes wonder what might have happened if we had been brave enough to talk about this when we were younger." Her voice softened even more, becoming a whisper made of honesty and years of emotional reflection. "And the truth is, even though we didn't explore anything romantic, even though life moved us in different directions, there's always been a part of me that cared about you more than I admitted. A part of me that held onto the connection we had, even when I didn't understand it. A part of me that still feels drawn to you." The last words hung between them like a confession wrapped in tenderness and time. Keanu felt his throat tighten with emotion, his breathing uneven, because hearing Sandra admit something he had carried for so long made him feel both relieved and overwhelmed. He squeezed her hand gently, his voice low and reverent when he finally spoke. "I always felt it too," he said. "No matter where I was in life, no matter what was happening, whenever we crossed paths, something inside me felt right, calm. And I didn't know how to explain it without ruining anything." Sandra smiled faintly through her tears, and the expression on her face was one of both longing and acceptance. "Maybe we were never meant to be together," she said softly. "Maybe we were meant to be something else, something steady, something grounding, something that stayed in our hearts even when everything else changed." She paused, her voice deepening with sincerity. "But hearing you say what you said tonight, it means more to me than you know." Keanu opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Sandra continued with a confession she had never spoken aloud, not even to herself. "There was a time," she whispered, "when I wished you had said something, not because I wanted a romance, not because I wanted a grand gesture, but because I wanted to know if what I felt wasn't one-sided. I wanted to know if the tenderness, the comfort, the connection was real for you too." Keanu stepped closer, not touching her yet, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence surrounding her like a protective shield. His voice, when he spoke, was filled with a tenderness that made her heart ache. "It was real," he whispered. "It was always real." Sandra's breath caught, her chest tightening with emotion, and for a moment she closed her eyes, letting the truth wash over her like a wave she had been waiting decades to feel. When she opened them again, her gaze held his with an intensity that made the entire world around them seem to disappear. "Then why didn't we ever talk about it?" she whispered. Keanu's answer came slowly, painfully, honestly. "Because timing is cruel sometimes, because we were young, because we were scared. Because I didn't want to pressure you, because life kept moving, because I thought I wasn't enough, because I didn't want to ruin something I treasured more than anything." Sandra's heart shattered at the last sentence, because she knew, without question, that he meant it. And she also knew that life had indeed been the one obstacle neither of them could control, shaping their choices, their timing, their separate destinies. She squeezed his hand gently, her voice trembling as she said, "Keanu, there's something else you need to know." Keanu looked at her with full attention, knowing instinctively that what she was about to say next would peel back the last layer of her truth. "I didn't just care about you," she whispered. "There were moments, quiet moments, when I think I might have loved you. Not in the way the world imagines, not in some dramatic movie kind of way, but in a way that felt peaceful, safe, real." Keanu blinked, stunned, overwhelmed, breathless, not because he expected a confession of love, but because her honesty brought healing to a part of his heart he had kept guarded for years. Sandra continued, her voice softer now. "I didn't understand it then. I don't even know if I fully understand it now. But I do know this. You were someone I held close even when I didn't say it, even when life went on." A long, trembling silence followed, the kind of silence that only exists between two people who have finally spoken the truths that shaped their connection. And in that silence, Keanu felt something shift inside him, something like closure but also awakening, something that felt both painful and beautiful. Sandra looked at him, her eyes glistening with emotion, and whispered, "So please don't think your feelings were one-sided. They were. Not then, not now." Keanu took a slow breath, overwhelmed by the magnitude of everything she had just confessed. And before he could speak, Sandra added one more truth, the one she had held closest to her heart. "And there's one more thing," she whispered, her voice barely holding together. "The biggest reason I never said anything back then wasn't fear of losing you, it was fear of losing myself. Because feeling something for someone as gentle and genuine as you scared me. It made me vulnerable. and I wasn't ready for that. Keanu felt tears sting his own eyes, rare, quiet tears he didn't fight, because hearing her admit that vulnerability made him realize that all the years of silence weren't wasted. They were simply waiting for this moment. Sandra exhaled deeply, her voice almost breaking. "So now you know my truth, the truth I never said." Keanu stepped even closer, his voice soft, reverent, and full of emotion. "Thank you for trusting me with that." And as they stood there, decades of unspoken emotions finally released, Sandra felt a weight lifting from her chest, one she didn't realize she had been carrying until this night. But neither of them knew that this was only the beginning of the conversation that would change everything between them. The night that opened old doors and new realities. The air on the balcony felt heavier now, not because something was wrong, but because something profound had finally been acknowledged, something that had lived between them for decades like an invisible thread connecting their hearts without either of them daring to pull too hard. After Sandra's confession, a fragile silence lingered, a silence filled not with awkwardness but with an emotional density that made every small sound around them feel amplified: the distant traffic, the soft humming of music from inside, the gentle rustling of leaves as the night breeze moved through them. Keanu stood motionless for a moment, his breath shallow as he processed the depth of what Sandra had revealed. Her truth had unlocked a chamber inside him that he had sealed long ago, a place filled with moments he never allowed himself to fully feel because he feared they would break him or make him yearn for something that might never be possible. Yet now, hearing her speak so openly, so vulnerably, he felt something inside him begin to soften and expand in ways that caught him off guard. Sandra kept her hand on his, a grounding gesture that reminded him that this moment wasn't a dream or a scene from a film. It was real, raw, unfiltered humanity between two people who had carried emotional weight for far too long. She looked at him with eyes that trembled, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming release of admitting a truth she had buried for more years than she cared to count. Her breath was uneven, as if her heart was still recalibrating itself after finally speaking the words she had never imagined she would say. And in that moment, she realized something unexpected. Admitting the truth didn't break her, it freed her. It freed her from the what-ifs, the suppressed emotions, the silent interpretations of moments she never allowed herself to analyze. It freed her from the fear that had kept her guarded for so long. Keanu finally spoke, his voice low and shaken with emotion. "Sandra," he whispered, "I don't know what to say. I never imagined hearing this from you, not after all these years." Sandra's lips curved into a soft, emotional smile, the kind of smile that carried both sadness and relief. "Neither did I," she admitted. "I didn't think I'd ever tell you. I thought I'd take it to my grave, honestly." Keanu's eyebrows pulled together in that subtle way he did when something moved him deeply. He lifted his other hand and placed it gently over hers, enveloping her touch with a warmth that made her heart clench. "I'm grateful you didn't," he said. "I'm grateful you chose this moment, tonight, to trust me with something so important." Sandra looked at him, her voice trembling. "Do you ever think about timing? How life makes us cross paths at moments we don't expect? How it holds back certain truths until we're finally ready?" Keanu nodded slowly, his gaze steady and contemplative. "I think timing is the universe's way of protecting us. Sometimes it doesn't give us what we want when we want it because we're not ready, or because we need to learn something first, or because something bigger is waiting for us down the road. And sometimes it gives us moments like this, moments that feel like the truth finally catching up to us." Sandra sighed softly, her shoulders dropping as though tension she had carried for years was dissolving. "Maybe you're right," she said. "Maybe we weren't meant to have this conversation back then. Maybe we weren't mature enough. Maybe we didn't know ourselves well enough. But tonight, everything feels clearer than it ever did." Keanu nodded, his eyes fixed on hers. "It does," he said. "It feels like we're finally seeing things with the kind of honesty that only comes with time." For a moment, neither of them spoke. They just stood there, hands intertwined, hearts unraveling, memories resurfacing, the city glowing beneath them like a reminder that life was vast and unpredictable and occasionally generous in the most unexpected ways. Sandra's gaze drifted upward to the sky, where faint stars peeked through the soft haze. "Do you remember?" she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of nostalgia. "That night after filming when we sat outside the trailer talking about life. You said something that stayed with me all these years." Keanu frowned slightly, trying to remember. "What did I say?" he asked. Sandra turned to him, her eyes soft. "You said, I don't know where life will take me, but I hope I always stay close to the people who make me feel like myself." And I remember thinking even then that you were one of the most genuine people I had ever met." Keanu's breath caught because he remembered the moment now. He remembered sitting beside her under the stars, talking about fears and dreams and life with a depth neither of them had expected to share at that age. "I didn't know you remembered that," he said, voice thick with emotion. Sandra smiled gently. "I remember everything about that night, the way you listened, the way you spoke, the way you made me feel safe, like I didn't have to pretend." Keanu's chest tightened painfully with the realization that she had felt the same things he had convinced himself were one-sided. He took a step closer, their bodies now only inches apart, the air between them warm with decades of unspoken emotion. "Sandra," he whispered, if I had known even a fraction of what you felt, I don't think I would have stayed silent. I would have told you everything sooner." But Sandra shook her head softly. "No," she said. "I think we needed the silence back then. We needed to grow separately. We needed to become the people we are now. If we had said these things too early, something might have broken, something might have gone wrong." She paused, her expression thoughtful. "You know what I realized tonight? Some connections don't need a label. They don't expire. They don't fade. They just evolve. And maybe that's what this is. Maybe this was never meant to be a love story in the traditional sense. Maybe it was meant to be something more rare." Keanu raised his eyebrows slightly. "More rare?" he echoed. Sandra nodded slowly, her eyes glistening with clarity. "Yes, a connection built on respect, on understanding, on decades of unspoken truth, something deep enough to withstand time, distance, life changes, something that doesn't need romance to be meaningful, something that lasts because it's rooted in who we are, not what people expect." Keanu listened, absorbing her words with a reverence that made Sandra's heart warm. "I think you're right," he said softly. "I think what we have is beyond labels, beyond timing, beyond anything the world could define." He paused, his voice dropping into a deeper emotional register. "But I also need you to know something. Even if we never called it love, even if life never took us down that path, there was never a moment in my life when I didn't care about you. Not one." Sandra's breath hitched, her eyes filling again, and she gently squeezed his hand. "I know," she whispered. "I've always known." They stood there for a long moment, letting the truth settle between them like a soft blanket. And then, as if the universe sensed they needed a small interruption to breathe again, the balcony door opened behind them, and a gentle wave of laughter from inside floated out into the night air. It was a reminder that they were still at a public event, still surrounded by people, still part of a world that expected them to maintain a certain composure. Sandra wiped her tears quickly but gracefully, breathing deeply to steady herself. Keanu did the same, though his eyes still glistened with the emotional gravity of the conversation. But neither wanted to go inside yet, neither wanted to break the sacredness of the moment. So Sandra leaned against the railing again, this time closer to him, their shoulders touching lightly in a way that felt natural, familiar, comforting. "Can I tell you something else?" she murmured. Keanu nodded. "Anything." Sandra laughed softly, the sound warm and bittersweet. "One of the reasons I never said anything back then was because I knew, deep down, that if I ever fell for someone like you, I would fall too hard, too deeply. And I didn't trust myself with that. You were too gentle, too good. I wasn't ready to be that vulnerable." Keanu felt a wave of emotion rise in him so strong he had to breathe deeply to steady himself. "Sandra," he said, voice trembling, "if you had fallen, I would have caught you." Those words, simple yet filled with unspoken tenderness, pierced through her guard, and she closed her eyes briefly, letting them settle into her heart like a truth she wished she had heard decades ago. When she opened her eyes again, she saw Keanu watching her with an expression she had seen only a handful of times, an expression that carried affection, vulnerability, and a quiet acceptance of everything they had finally brought to light. She smiled softly through her tears. "Thank you," she whispered, "for saying that, for everything tonight." Keanu shook his head gently. "Thank you," he said, "for trusting me with your truth, for carrying this for so long, for letting me in." Sandra looked down at their intertwined hands, marveling at how something so simple could feel so emotionally charged. "We can't change the past," she said softly, "but maybe we can honor what it meant." Keanu nodded. "We can and we should." A long pause followed, comfortable now, filled with warmth instead of uncertainty. Finally, Sandra lifted her head and exhaled slowly. "So where do we go from here?" she asked, her voice sincere and curious, not in a romantic sense, but in the sense of two souls ready to step into a new phase of their connection with honesty and clarity. Keanu took a moment, thinking deeply before answering. "We go forward," he said. Not as people wondering what could have been, but as people who finally understand what we shared and still share. We go forward with truth, with gratitude, with whatever this connection becomes next. Sandra nodded slowly, the words sinking into her heart like a soothing balm. "I like that," she whispered, moving forward, knowing, not guessing. Keanu smiled softly. "Knowing," he repeated. And in that simple word, an entire future, undefined yet grounded, emotional yet peaceful, stretched out before them, waiting to be discovered. But neither of them knew that the night still held one more revelation, one more moment that would bring them even closer to understanding the depth of what they meant to each other. The moment the past and future finally touched. The balcony had become a world of its own, a quiet corner suspended above the chatter of the charity gala, a place where time softened its grip and allowed two hearts to speak with a depth they had withheld for decades. Sandra and Keanu remained there, leaning against the railing with their hands still intertwined, neither of them willing to break the delicate physical connection that had in one night come to symbolize more than years of friendship ever had. The breeze brushed against their skin, carrying with it the muted laughter and polished music from inside, but neither of them paid attention. Their focus remained fixed on each other, on the truth that had finally been unearthed, on the emotional closeness that felt both overwhelming and unexpectedly natural. Sandra felt lighter than she had in years, not because the night had healed anything completely, but because it had finally given her room to breathe in the truth she had avoided, room to let go of the confusion she had carried quietly beneath her public persona. Keanu felt similarly transformed, as though opening this truth had peeled away a layer of emotional armor he never fully acknowledged wearing. Sandra shifted slightly, letting her shoulder rest a little more comfortably against his, and Keanu felt the familiar warmth of her presence, a warmth he had always been sensitive to no matter how many times life had moved them apart. She exhaled softly, her gaze lowering to the city below, the lights shimmering like scattered memories. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice gentle but contemplative, "about why tonight feels different, why it feels like closure but also something new." Keanu listened carefully, his expression thoughtful. "What do you mean?" he asked. Sandra took her time before answering. "It feels like for the first time we're not hiding behind jokes or interviews or timing or industry expectations. We're just being us. Two people who lived a little, lost a little, learned a lot, and finally found the courage to say what should have been said a long time ago." Her voice trembled at the end, not with sadness, but with a bittersweet recognition of how far they had come. Keanu nodded slowly, his eyes softening. "You're right," he agreed. "For so long we were afraid of talking about the past because we didn't want to ruin the present. But now maybe we're finally at a place where honesty doesn't threaten anything. It just adds clarity." Sandra smiled faintly at his words, a smile full of emotion, gratitude, and an unspoken understanding that what they shared now felt more stable, more rooted than anything their younger selves could have handled. "You know," she said softly, "for years people asked me why I always lit up whenever your name came up, why I always defended you, why I always spoke about you with so much respect, and I never gave them the real answer." Keanu raised an eyebrow gently. "And what was the real answer?" Sandra inhaled slowly, the weight of her next words gathering in her chest. "Because some people stay in your life as reminders," she whispered. "Reminders of who you were, who you became, and who you're still capable of being. You were that for me, Keanu. You were the constant, even when everything else changed." Her voice shook with emotion as she said it, and Keanu's breath hitched because he felt the depth of her truth land heavily in his heart. He turned slightly to face her more fully, his expression tender. "Sandra, you've been the constant for me too, even when we weren't talking often, even when we didn't see each other for years. There was always this place inside me that carried you with me, not as a regret, not as a missed opportunity, but as someone who shaped me even without trying." Sandra blinked, her eyes moistening again, and she bit her lower lip in an attempt to keep her emotions from spilling out too quickly. But Keanu wasn't done. "You helped me see things I didn't see in myself," he said. "Back then I was quiet, insecure in ways people never knew about, unsure of my place in the industry, unsure of who I was becoming. But you always made me feel like I belonged, like I mattered, like I wasn't just another actor trying to figure things out." Sandra let out a soft, trembling breath at his confession, feeling a warmth spread through her chest, a warmth made of appreciation, gratitude, and the emotional bond they had nurtured without even realizing it. She turned toward him, her hand still resting in his, and whispered, "I wish I had known that. I wish I could have told you how much I admired you too." Keanu smiled gently, a smile filled with both humility and affection. "Maybe we weren't supposed to know then," he said. "Maybe we were supposed to find out now. For a moment, neither spoke. Their breaths synced naturally, their shoulders touching lightly, their hands still clasped with the kind of ease that only comes after years of mutual trust. Then Sandra sighed softly, her tone shifting into something more reflective. "There's something I never admitted to anyone," she began, "not even to myself until later in life." Keanu watched her with full attention, recognizing the tone she used whenever she was about to reveal something deeply personal. Sandra looked down at her hand in his, tracing the shape of his fingers gently with her thumb. "Whenever life hit me hard during breakups, career pressures, personal losses, there was always this part of me that wished I had someone like you there. Not romantically, not as a partner, just someone with your kindness, someone with your steadiness, someone with your way of seeing people beyond their surface." Keanu swallowed, feeling emotion build in his chest. Sandra continued, her voice thick with sincerity. "You were always that person in my head, the one who represented calm, honesty, humility. Even when we weren't talking, you were like this quiet force reminding me that gentleness still existed in the world." Keanu looked down, moved almost beyond words. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked just slightly. "Sandra, I never knew you felt that way. I always thought you were the strong one, the one who didn't need anyone." Sandra let out a small, emotional laugh. "I pretended I didn't, but I did. Everyone does." The weight of her honesty settled between them like a tender revelation, reshaping their connection into something even more intimate and transparent. They weren't two actors reliving old memories. They were two people acknowledging the emotional truth that had shaped their lives quietly from the background. Sandra leaned closer to him, resting her forearm lightly against his as she gazed at the city lights. "Can I ask you something?" she murmured. Keanu nodded. "Anything." Sandra hesitated for a moment, gathering courage, then asked softly, "Was there ever a moment you almost told me, really almost told me?" Keanu inhaled, his jaw tightening slightly with the memory. "Yes," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Once." Sandra's eyes widened with curiosity and anticipation, and Keanu continued after a long, deep breath. "It was years after Speed. You were hosting an event, maybe late 90s or early 2000s. I saw you across the room, and you were laughing with someone, looking happy in a way that made everyone else fade into the background. And I remember thinking, if I don't tell her now, I never will." Sandra's heart pounded as she listened, imagining the moment, imagining how their entire history could have shifted from that one choice. Keanu looked up at the sky as though revisiting the memory. "I walked halfway to you, halfway, and then I stopped." Sandra's breath caught. "Why?" Keanu closed his eyes for a moment, the pain of old hesitation etched into his expression. "Because you looked content, genuinely content, and I didn't want to disrupt that. I didn't want to risk burdening you with something that might complicate your life." Sandra felt tears prick the corners of her eyes, tears of tenderness, of understanding, of a deep ache for the younger versions of themselves who didn't know how to navigate the emotions they carried. "You wouldn't have burdened me," she whispered. "You could never have burdened me." Keanu smiled faintly, but there was a sadness beneath it. "I didn't know that then. I didn't trust myself. I didn't trust timing." Sandra turned fully toward him, her hand tightening around his with a sincerity that made his breath falter. "But you see," she said gently, "that's the part I wish you understood. You were never a disruption. You were never a complication. You were the calming presence, the one who made everything feel less heavy." Keanu looked at her, his eyes shining with emotion, and Sandra felt her chest tighten as the truth of her words sunk in for him. They stood there in silence again, but it wasn't heavy. It was a silence filled with meaning, with acceptance, with newfound clarity that wrapped around them like a warm blanket. And then Sandra spoke again, softly but with a firm emotional grounding. "Maybe," she said, "the universe didn't want us together romantically. Maybe it wanted us to be something else, something steadier, something deeper, something that lasts longer than any relationship could." Keanu nodded in agreement, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe so. Maybe we were meant to be each other's reminder. A reminder of who we were, who we could be, and what truly matters." Sandra smiled, feeling her heart settle into a peaceful rhythm she hadn't felt in years. "But I'm glad we finally talked about it," she said. "I'm glad we're not hiding from it anymore." Keanu's gaze met hers with a warmth that felt like a soft embrace. "Me too," he whispered, "more than you know." A gentle quietness enveloped them again, and in that stillness, Sandra leaned her head lightly against his shoulder, not romantically, not suggestively, but with the natural ease of someone who felt safe enough to rest. Keanu lowered his head slightly, closing his eyes as the moment washed over him, feeling a sense of emotional closure and renewal at the same time. Sandra's voice broke the silence after a long moment, soft and reflective. "Tonight feels like a turning point," she whispered. Not a beginning or an ending, but a shift, a deeper understanding. Keanu nodded. It does, he agreed. It feels like we finally set down something heavy we didn't know we were carrying. Sandra breathed deeply, feeling the truth of his words resonate in her bones. And now, she said quietly, we get to move forward with honesty. Keanu smiled. With honesty, he echoed. What neither of them realized was that the emotional openness of this night was about to take them into a territory neither had ever explored. A moment still waiting for them, one that would reveal the most vulnerable truth of all. The confession that changed everything without breaking anything. The night had stretched far beyond what either of them expected, yet neither Keanu nor Sandra felt the slightest urge to return inside. The gala continued without them, voices fading into a distant hum, music drifting softly from the open doors. But the balcony had become a sanctuary, a small, elevated universe where time moved slower, where the weight of their shared history floated gently around them, and where the truths long buried beneath years of polite silence finally rose into the air like a storm releasing its first drops of long-awaited rain. They stood together beneath the soft glow of hanging lights, still leaning against the railing, their hands loosely intertwined, their shoulders touching with a familiarity that felt natural in ways neither of them fully understood until now. The breeze had grown cooler, the moon hung higher, and the cityscape shimmered like a reminder that even in a world filled with noise, clarity could still be found in the quietest moments. Sandra took a slow breath, feeling the peaceful exhaustion that follows an emotional release, the kind that leaves the heart tender but stronger, as though honesty had peeled away old layers of fear and replaced them with something gentler. She looked at Keanu, who was gazing out over the city as if replaying every word they had exchanged tonight, every emotion they had finally allowed themselves to feel. His face was calm, but beneath that calmness was depth, a complexity built from years of loss, endurance, patience, and quiet affection. Sandra had always admired that about him, his ability to feel deeply without demanding anything from the world, without projecting his pain onto others, without losing his gentleness even when life had been unspeakably cruel. She shifted slightly, turning toward him, her voice soft but steady. "Keanu," she whispered, "there's one more thing I've never told you, something deeper than what I said before." Keanu turned to her slowly, his eyes attentive, the warmth in them unmistakable. "I'm listening," he said, his tone gentle yet filled with anticipation. Sandra inhaled deeply, bracing herself to unlock a truth that had lived within her for so long it felt woven into her emotional DNA. "I didn't just care for you. I didn't just admire you. The truth is," her voice trembled, but she didn't hold back. "The truth is that during some of the hardest moments of my life, moments when I felt overwhelmed, lost, or just exhausted from being strong all the time, you were the person I wished I could run to." Keanu's breath caught, and for a long, fragile moment he didn't speak. Sandra continued, her eyes glistening with sincerity illuminated by the soft balcony light. "Not because I expected you to fix anything, not because I wanted a romantic rescue or anything dramatic, but because something about your presence, your heart, your energy always felt safe to me. Calm, real. You were the person I imagined sitting beside me on the worst days, someone who wouldn't ask questions, who wouldn't judge, who wouldn't need explanations, just someone who would be there." Her voice thickened with emotion. "And sometimes, Keanu, that kind of longing is its own kind of love, not the romantic kind, not the kind people sensationalize, but a deeper kind, a soul-level connection." Keanu felt the world around him blur for a moment as he absorbed her words, each one sinking into the quietest, most protected parts of his heart. He swallowed hard, his voice barely steady when he finally responded. "Sandra, I wish I had known. I wish I could have been there for you in all the ways you needed. I would have shown up in a heartbeat." Sandra exhaled, a sad, soft smile touching her lips. "I know you would have. That's why I never asked, because you already carried so much. And I didn't want to add to your burdens." Keanu shook his head slowly, his expression filled with a tenderness that almost broke her. "You could never be a burden," he said quietly, his voice deep with sincerity. "Never, not then, not now, not ever." The emotional gravity of his words enveloped her, pulling tears into her eyes not from pain, but from the overwhelming sense of being understood, seen, in a way she had rarely experienced in her life. She turned her face away briefly, wiping a tear with the back of her hand, and Keanu instinctively moved closer, not touching her face but placing his hand lightly over hers, grounding her with the warmth of his presence. She looked back at him, her eyes shimmering, and whispered, "Thank you. Thank you for always being exactly who you are." Keanu felt a tremor move through him, A soft, emotional quake triggered by her appreciation, her vulnerability, her quiet revelations that had peeled back layers of time and placed both of their hearts into the open. "Sandra," he murmured, "you don't know how many times I wished I could tell you what you meant to me, not romantically, just as a human being, as someone who brought light into my life even from afar." Sandra's breath fluttered, touched by the unexpected symmetry between their truths. "Then tell me now," she whispered gently. "Tell me what you never said." And so he did. He took a breath, deep and deliberate, and spoke with the kind of honesty that comes only when someone has nothing left to hide. "You were one of the first people in my life who made me feel like I didn't have to perform," he said softly. "Like I didn't have to be charming or strong or mysterious or anything else the world expected me to be. With you, I could just be me. And that kind of simplicity is rare. So rare that I held on to it, protected it, maybe even idolized it at times, because it reminded me that life could be gentle, even when everything else felt heavy." Sandra's breath caught as she listened to him speak, her heart swelling at the tenderness she had always sensed but never fully understood. Keanu continued, his eyes softening. "And there were moments, quiet moments, when I missed you without even realizing why. Moments when I'd hear your laugh in an interview or see your name somewhere and feel something flicker inside me. A warmth, a familiarity, something like home." He paused, his voice trembling slightly. "And I think part of me always knew that our connection was different, that it wasn't something the world could categorize, that it wasn't something we needed to define." Sandra felt her heart melt under the weight of his words, felt tears slide down her cheeks again, uncontrolled but welcomed, because this was the kind of truth that meant something, the kind that validated the years of unspoken emotion, the kind that bridged the gap between who they were and who they had become. "Keanu," she whispered, her voice breaking, "thank you for saying that, for giving those feelings a voice, for letting me hear what I always sensed but never knew for sure." He squeezed her hand gently, the gesture filled with emotional clarity, and Sandra felt a peace settle around them like a warm blanket. For a moment, neither of them spoke, letting the intimacy of their confessions settle into the night air, letting the softness of honesty soothe the parts of their hearts still tender from years of silence. The moonlight glowed across Sandra's face, highlighting the vulnerability that made her look more human, more real, more grounded than she ever appeared on screen. Keanu studied her quietly, aware of how precious this moment was, aware that their connection had deepened in a way neither of them could have predicted. After a long moment, Sandra broke the silence with a soft, reflective tone. "Do you ever wonder," she murmured, "if maybe the timing was never wrong, maybe it was just incomplete, like our story wasn't supposed to be one thing, maybe it was supposed to unfold across decades, slowly, gently, exactly like this?" Keanu thought about it, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe," he agreed quietly. "Maybe some people are meant to grow into the truth instead of rushing into it." Sandra nodded, absorbing his words with warmth. "And maybe we're finally at the part of our lives where we can appreciate this connection without fear, without confusion, without needing it to be more or less than what it is." Keanu smiled softly, a small curve of the lips filled with peace. "I think we are," he murmured. A long breath escaped Sandra's lungs, a breath that felt like the release of a lifetime of emotional restraint. She leaned her head gently on Keanu's shoulder again, and he leaned slightly toward her, their bodies settling into a quiet closeness that felt like a natural extension of everything they had confessed tonight. This wasn't romance. This wasn't regret. This wasn't longing for a life they missed out on. This was something deeper, an emotional companionship, a soul-level respect, a bond that surpassed the boundaries of love and friendship because it was carved from years of sincerity, patience, and tenderness. And then Sandra spoke again, her voice soft and almost trembling. "Keanu, there's something I need to say, something important." Keanu lifted his head slightly, turning to look at her, his eyes gentle. "What is it?" he asked. Sandra inhaled, steadying herself, and whispered, "Tonight didn't make me fall for you. That happened a long time ago, in a different way, in a different form than people imagine. But tonight made me understand something I never saw clearly." Keanu held her gaze, his heartbeat slowing as he braced for her truth. Sandra continued, her words flowing from a place of emotional clarity. "You didn't just matter to me in the past, you matter to me now, still. In ways I didn't realize until tonight." Keanu felt his breath shift, not sharply but deeply, as though her words had reached the center of him. "Sandra," he whispered, but she gently raised a hand, stopping him so she could finish. "And I need you to know," she said, her voice trembling with sincerity, "that no matter what life looks like for either of us, I will always carry this night with me, not as a regret, not as a wish for something else, but as a reminder that honesty can heal things we didn't know were aching." Keanu's eyes softened with emotion, and he nodded slowly. "I'll carry it too," he said, his voice steady but full. "I'll carry it as proof that connections like ours exist, rare, quiet, unbreakable." They stood there for a long time, letting their hearts settle into the new truth of who they were to each other. The wind brushed softly past them, the music from inside grew gentler, the night deepened, and something in both of them felt peaceful. Finally, Sandra sighed softly, a bittersweet smile on her face. "I guess we should go inside eventually," she murmured. Keanu laughed quietly, a warm, soft sound. "Eventually," he agreed, neither moving. Sandra glanced at him, her smile growing. "Not yet," she asked. Keanu shook his head gently. "Not yet." They remained there on the balcony, leaning against each other, hands still intertwined, hearts lighter and more open than they had been in years. No romance needed to define this moment. No labels required. No expectations placed on what came next. This was something different. This was healing. This was understanding. This was two souls finally telling the truth. And as the night held them gently beneath its quiet stars, Sandra whispered the final words that would anchor this moment in both of their lives forever. "Thank you for being the one constant I didn't know I needed." Keanu closed his eyes, letting her words wrap around him, and whispered back with a depth that reached into the very center of the connection they shared. "And thank you for being the truth I was finally brave enough to face." The night exhaled around them, and their story, long unspoken, finally felt complete.